Dad took a slow breath, as if he had rehearsed what came next. "We can't keep supporting this lifestyle." I frowned. "Supporting what lifestyle?" Mom stepped forward. "You come here whenever you need something. You use our garage, borrow tools, ask your father for advice. At some point, you have to stand on your own." For a second, I honestly thought they were joking. "I have never asked you for money," I said. "Not once." Vanessa rolled her eyes. "Money isn't the only kind of help, Mason. You've been floating around for years, acting like everything is fine." Everything was more than fine. That morning I had signed a contract with nearly $4 million. But there was something almost fascinating about watching three people speak with absolute confidence about a life they knew nothing about. Dad pointed toward the front door. "Then prove us wrong. From now on, no more coming here when things go bad. No emergency calls, no asking us to rescue you. If you're as independent as you claim, live like it." Mom added, "Maybe being completely on your own will finally force you to grow up." Vanessa leaned back against the sofa, looking satisfied. I stared at them for several seconds. They expected an argument, maybe an apology. Maybe they thought I would finally confess that my business was collapsing and beg them for another chance. Instead, I picked up my jacket. "Okay." Dad blinked. "Okay? If that's what you want." Mom looked almost disappointed by how easily I accepted it. "Mason, we're doing this because we care about you." I opened the door. Of course. Outside, cold rain covered the driveway. I walked toward my SUV without looking back. They probably saw an ordinary 5-year-old vehicle parked under the streetlight. What they didn't know was that I kept it because I liked being unnoticed. My other car, a new graphite gray Porsche, was sitting in the private garage beneath my building. As I pulled away, I wasn't devastated. I was tired. For years I had tolerated the jokes because they seemed harmless. I had ignored the comparisons, the dismissive comments, the little lectures about responsibility. But tonight felt different. They hadn't just misunderstood me, they had built an entire version of my life in their heads and then punished me for it. The strange part was that I could have ended everything with one sentence. I could have told them what my companies were worth. I could have shown them my investment accounts. I could have driven them to the penthouse they assumed I couldn't afford. But I didn't. Something told me the truth would mean more if they discovered it themselves. The next week passed without a single message. No apology, no "are you okay?" Nothing. I worked from my home office overlooking downtown Denver, taking meetings with teams in Toronto, London, and Austin, while my family apparently imagined me sleeping on someone's couch. On Wednesday, my cousin Ethan called. Unlike Vanessa, Ethan had never treated me like a joke. "Hey," he said carefully, "did something happen with your parents?" "Why?" There was a pause. "Your mom told Aunt Carol that you're struggling financially. She said they finally stopped enabling you." I leaned back in my chair. "Interesting. It gets worse," Ethan said. "Vanessa told people you'll probably come asking her for a job soon." I laughed once, quietly. "What kind of job?" She joked that maybe her office needs someone to organize deliveries. That did it. Until then, I had considered the whole situation pathetic. Now it was becoming insulting. They weren't simply waiting for me to fail, they were enjoying a failure that didn't even exist.
By the third week, curiosity got the better of me. Ethan said my parents were still hosting Sunday dinners, and my name had become a regular topic. Every story apparently ended the same way. Mason had been warned, Mason refused to listen, Mason was finally facing reality. So that Sunday, I drove past their neighborhood. Not in the SUV, I took the Porsche. I parked several houses away and walked to a corner where I could see their dining room through the windows. Mom sat at one end of the table, Dad at the other, and Vanessa was beside them, laughing with a glass of wine in her hand. For a moment, I watched. They needed me to be struggling because it made their choices look wise. Vanessa was the successful daughter who followed the rules. I was the reckless son who ignored everyone and paid the price. Except none of it was true. 2 days later, Mom called. "Mason, your father and I need help next weekend. We're clearing furniture out of the basement." "I'm busy." "With what?" "Work." A short silence. Then that familiar amused tone returned. "Right, your business." "Yes." She sighed. "Just remember, family matters too. You never know when you might need us." I looked around my office. One monitor showed our strongest quarter ever. Another held plans for a new division in Amsterdam. I'll remember that. After we hung up, something clicked. They genuinely believed they were my safety net. In their minds, sooner or later I would fail badly enough to come crawling back. So I decided not to correct them. Not yet. If I revealed everything now, they would say I got lucky or that someone else had carried me. If the truth came out, I wanted it to arrive in a way they couldn't explain away. Then, on Thursday morning, everything changed. I was halfway through coffee when an alert appeared from one of my old bank accounts. Unusual account activity. I opened the banking app directly. 2 withdrawals, $6,800 each, both made in person. The account was old, barely used. My parents had opened it with me when I was 17, and I had forgotten they were still connected to the original paperwork. The branch was less than 5 minutes from their house. I called the bank. After several transfers, an employee finally found the transaction notes. Mr. Reed, both withdrawals were processed by an authorized party on the original account. Who? She hesitated. Diane Reed. My mother. Did she give a reason? She stated the money was needed for a family emergency. A family emergency. Using my money. Without asking me? I ended the call and phoned Ethan. When I explained what happened, he went silent. Then he said, Mason, I think I know where the money went. Where? Vanessa bought a new Range Rover 3 days ago. I didn't answer. She's been telling everyone your parents helped with the down payment. I stared through my office windows at the Denver skyline. For weeks, their behavior had been insulting. Now it was something else entirely. They hadn't just mocked me. They had taken from me to reward the person they believed deserved more. And that was the moment the entire situation stopped being fun. That evening, I drove to my parents' house. I didn't knock. I parked across the street and watched through the front windows. Vanessa was standing in the living room holding up a set of keys while Mom took pictures with her phone. Dad was laughing beside them, looking proud. The new Range Rover sat in the driveway. My money was in that car. For years, I had convinced myself that their favoritism was irritating but harmless. Vanessa got more attention, more praise, more help. I learned to expect less. But watching them celebrate something purchased partly with money they had taken from me broke whatever loyalty was left. 3 days later, Mom texted. Hope you're not upset about the old savings account. Vanessa needed help and the money wasn't being used. You're young. You'll earn more someday. Family comes first. I read it twice. No apology, no question, not even an attempt to pretend she had misunderstood. She genuinely believed she had the right to decide what happened to my money. I didn't respond. Instead, I called my attorney. By the end of the week, every account, investment, property document, and business interest connected to my name had been reviewed. Anything that still gave my parents even theoretical access was closed or transferred. I wasn't leaving another unlocked door. But strangely, the anger didn't disappear. It changed. For a while, I withdrew from almost everyone. I skipped dinners with friends, avoided events, and worked longer hours than usual. My businesses were doing well. I still went to the gym every morning, still answered calls, still made decisions. But privately, I kept replaying the same question. How had I let this go on for so long? One night, sitting alone in my kitchen, I opened an old photo album on my phone. There was a picture from a family vacation in California 6 years earlier. Mom, Dad, and Vanessa were standing together outside a rented beach house. I was half visible at the edge of the frame. That trip came back instantly. Vanessa had been given the master bedroom. My parents had the second bedroom. I slept on a pull-out couch because they had forgotten to include me when choosing the house. At the time, I laughed it off. Looking at that photo now, I realized the bank account wasn't an isolated incident. It was simply the first time their behavior had become impossible to excuse. I had always been the one expected to compromise, the one who should understand, the one who should give something up because Vanessa needed it more. They assumed I would complain for a few weeks and eventually show up at Sunday dinner like nothing happened. That assumption became useful. I stopped thinking about confronting them immediately. I started thinking about timing. First, I asked my attorney to make sure my finances were completely protected. Then I hired a financial investigator I had worked with during a business acquisition. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. I simply wanted a clear picture of my family's financial situation using records and information that could be obtained legitimately. A few weeks later, the first report arrived. It surprised me. My parents weren't nearly as financially secure as they pretended to be. Their retirement accounts were shrinking, they still carried debt on a vacation property, and Vanessa, despite the salary she loved mentioning, was spending far beyond her income. Credit cards, personal loans, a second mortgage on her Chicago condo. Even the Range Rover wasn't really hers. The money taken from me had covered only part of the down payment. The rest was financed. For the first time, I understood something important. Their confidence wasn't strength, it was appearance. And appearances were the one thing they cared about most.
The deeper I looked, the more fragile the picture became. My father had also invested heavily in a regional development company based outside Denver. On paper, it looked respectable. In reality, the company had been bleeding money for nearly a year. Worse, Dad had personally guaranteed part of one of its loans. If the company collapsed, he wouldn't just lose his investment, he could owe hundreds of thousands. That changed how I saw everything. I didn't need to attack them. I didn't need to threaten anyone or create some dramatic confrontation. All I had to do was wait. Around the same time, my own businesses entered one of the strongest periods we had ever had. I approved 2 expansion projects I had delayed for months, one in Germany and another in Singapore. New teams were hired, partnerships were signed, contracts worth several $1 million closed within weeks. And instead of hiding completely, I started appearing at industry events again, investor dinners, technology conferences, charity galas. Not because I wanted attention, but because I no longer saw any reason to make myself smaller. Still, I posted almost nothing online. If my family learned the truth, I wanted them to hear it from other people. That started happening sooner than expected. Ethan called me one afternoon. Your mom asked me something weird. What? She heard you were in London last week. She wanted to know if somebody paid for your trip. I laughed. I was meeting investors. I figured, Vanessa apparently thinks you're exaggerating your business. Of course she does. According to Ethan, one of Vanessa's colleagues had seen me at a conference in New York speaking with the founder of a major retail platform. Another acquaintance spotted me leaving a private dinner at a hotel in Manhattan. Little pieces of reality were reaching them. For the first time, they weren't completely sure of their story. Then, one of my smaller investments changed everything. 4 years earlier, I had put money into a software company that built inventory systems for online retailers. The company had grown quietly, and I still owned a significant share. That summer, it was acquired. My portion of the sale reached 8 figures. When the deal closed, my accountant called to confirm the final amount. I sat in my office staring at the number and thought about Mom's message. You'll earn more someday. Apparently, someday had arrived. A week later, I flew to New York for meetings. Afterward, I met with Claire Morgan, an editor from a national business publication. We had known each other casually for a few years. Over coffee, she mentioned a feature her magazine was preparing. It's about entrepreneurs who were underestimated early in life, she said. People who ignored conventional advice and built something substantial anyway. I smiled. That sounds familiar. It should. I want you in it. I initially assumed she meant a short interview. She didn't. Claire wanted a full profile, professional photography, my companies, the university dropout story, the years spent building quietly while people around me assumed I was failing. You could be the centerpiece, she said. For several seconds, I said nothing. Then an idea formed. When would it be published? Probably October. October. According to the financial report, my father's development investment was unlikely to survive much beyond that. Can you guarantee October? Claire raised an eyebrow. If you agree today, yes. I reached across the table and shook her hand. Then I met.
By late September, my father's investment was deteriorating exactly as predicted. The development company missed one payment, then another. Subcontractors began complaining about delays, and several suppliers stopped extending credit. Dad still acted as if everything was under control, at least publicly. Ethan told me Sunday dinners had become noticeably quieter whenever money came up. They're nervous, he said. Your dad keeps saying the project just needs a few more months. It didn't have a few more months. Then an unexpected opportunity landed in front of me. One of the real estate investment groups I had worked with before was purchasing distressed development projects around Colorado. Their managing partner called me personally. We're building a portfolio, he explained. Half-finished residential sites, struggling developers, properties banks don't want to hold. You interested? Send me the list. The document arrived that afternoon. I opened it casually, then stopped. Highlighted near the middle was a townhouse development outside Boulder. I recognized the company name immediately. It was the project tied to my father's investment. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. I hadn't created this opportunity. I hadn't contacted the lenders. The project was simply failing, and business had put me on the opposite side of the table. I called my attorney. Review everything connected to this property. What are you thinking? If it defaults and the numbers make sense, I want the option to buy. He was silent for a second. You realize whose project this is? Yes. And you're comfortable with that? I'm interested in the investment, nothing more. That wasn't entirely true, but I also wasn't going to manipulate the company into collapsing. If it survived, I would walk away. If it failed on its own, I would treat it like any other distressed asset. Over the next few weeks, we reviewed construction estimates, debt obligations, permits, and projected resale values. The numbers were surprisingly good. The problem wasn't the development itself, it was poor management and too much debt. With proper funding, the project could be finished profitably. I authorized the investment group to move forward if the lender took control. Meanwhile, the magazine interview was completed. Claire's team flew to Denver for photographs and spent 2 full days interviewing me. They asked about everything: dropping out of university, starting my first business from a bedroom, working 18-hour days, losing clients, nearly running out of cash during my first year. Eventually, Claire asked the question I knew was coming. Who doubted you the most? I looked out the window. People close to me. Family? I smiled slightly. I'd rather leave names out of it. She understood. The article didn't need villains. The facts were enough. Then October arrived. On the first Monday morning, I walked into my kitchen and found the magazine waiting on the counter. My assistant had sent it over before sunrise. My face was on the cover. Behind me was the Denver skyline. The headline read, "The Man Nobody Saw Coming." Inside was a 10-page feature documenting the businesses I had built, the companies I had invested in, and the recent acquisition that had pushed my net worth far beyond anything my family imagined. By 9 a.m., my phone was exploding. Former classmates, investors, employees, people I hadn't spoken to in years. Then, at 9:47, a message appeared from Mom. "Mason, we just saw the article. We had no idea your business had become this successful. Your father and I are incredibly proud of you." I stared at the word proud. 3 months earlier, she had told people I was practically homeless. Now she was proud. I locked my phone without replying, because the magazine wasn't the real surprise. It was only the first domino.
11 days later, my father's development company officially defaulted on its primary loan. The lender seized control of the project. 48 hours after that, the investment group submitted its offer. And because I supplied the largest portion of the capital, when the acquisition closed, I became the controlling owner of the development my father had spent years boasting about. The irony was almost perfect. The son they believed couldn't build a career now owned the project that was supposed to secure their future. 3 days after the acquisition closed, I had my assistant contact my parents and Vanessa. The invitation was simple: dinner at a private restaurant to discuss a business matter. After the magazine article, they accepted immediately. When I arrived, Mom hugged me. Dad shook my hand. Vanessa smiled at my suit. 3 months earlier, she had joked about giving me delivery work. Now I was worth impressing. We ordered dinner and made small talk. Dad wanted to know how many employees I had. Vanessa asked about the article. Halfway through the main course, Dad leaned forward. "So your assistant mentioned a business opportunity?" "Yes." I placed a thin black folder on the table and slid it toward him. He opened it. His smile disappeared. He turned one page, then another. "What is this?" "You know what it is." His eyes lifted toward me. "This is the Boulder development?" "It is." Mom frowned. "What does that mean?" Dad answered quietly. "It means Mason owns it." The table went silent. Vanessa stared at me. "You bought Dad's project?" "No. The company defaulted. The lender took control, my group made the strongest bid, and I supplied most of the capital." Dad's jaw tightened. "You knew I was involved?" "I did." "And you still did it?" The numbers made sense. Mom's face reddened. "How could you do this to your own father?" I looked at her. "Did you ask yourself that before taking money from my account?" She froze. Vanessa looked down at her plate. "You walked into a bank, withdrew my money without asking, and gave it to Vanessa for a car." "We explained that," Mom said. "No, you justified it." Dad pushed the folder away. "This is revenge." "No, if I wanted revenge, I could have interfered before the company failed. I didn't. Your business collapsed on its own. I bought an asset legally because it was profitable." Vanessa finally spoke. "So this is supposed to teach us a lesson?" I turned toward her. "No. I stopped trying to teach this family anything a long time ago." For once, nobody answered. I opened the folder again. "The workers stay. The contractors will be paid. Construction resumes next month." Dad looked at me. "And me?" "You're no longer connected to the project." His expression hardened. "You're firing your own father?" "I'm replacing the previous management of an asset my company owns." I hadn't taken something from him. He had already lost it. I was simply there when ownership changed. Mom's voice softened. "We're still your family." "Yes," I said, "but being family didn't stop you from stealing from me, humiliating me, or telling everyone I was a failure." Silence. I finished my dinner, paid the bill, and stood. Before leaving, I looked at Dad. "You once told me to prove I could survive without your help." I buttoned my jacket. I did. Then I walked out, leaving them beneath the warm restaurant lights with the truth they could no longer explain away.
The fallout began almost immediately. 2 days after dinner, Ethan called. "You really did it," he said. "Did what?" "Turn their entire world upside down." I leaned back in my chair. "What happened?" "Your dad hasn't been answering anyone. Your mom's calling relatives trying to explain that the development was taken from them unfairly." "It wasn't." "I know. Apparently everyone else knows too." That was the problem with building your reputation around appearances. Once the image cracked, people noticed every weakness underneath it. News of the failed development moved quickly through my parents' social circle. Dad had spent years describing the project as his smartest investment. He had told friends it would fund their retirement. Now those same people knew the company had defaulted, and that I had become the controlling investor who rescued the project afterward. The irony was impossible to hide. According to Ethan, some people were even connecting it to the magazine article. The irresponsible son they had spent years criticizing had quietly built enough wealth to purchase the biggest investment they had ever made. I didn't spread that story. I didn't have to. People did it for me. Vanessa's situation wasn't improving either. Her Range Rover payment was much higher than she had admitted, and without Mom and Dad covering her financial emergencies, the numbers stopped working. A month later, she traded it for a much cheaper vehicle. Normally, I wouldn't have cared, but Vanessa had spent years treating possessions like evidence of superiority. So when she arrived at her office in an ordinary sedan, people noticed. Then came the condo. She listed it quietly, hoping nobody would ask questions. Ethan sent me the listing one evening. "Looks like someone's downsizing." I stared at the photos. Designer furniture, marble kitchen, perfect skyline view. Everything Vanessa had once used to prove that she was the successful one. I closed the message. Her problems weren't my victory. They were simply consequences. My parents contacted me twice during those weeks. Mom texted first. "Mason, can we please talk? Whatever happened, we're still family. We shouldn't let money destroy us." I almost laughed at the wording. Money hadn't destroyed us. Their behavior had. I didn't answer. Several days later, Dad left a voicemail. His voice sounded different, less commanding. "Mason, this has gone far enough. We need to figure out some way forward. You can't just shut your family out forever." I deleted the message halfway through. For years, they had acted like access to them was something I needed to earn.
Now they were discovering that access to me wasn't guaranteed either. Meanwhile, the Boulder development moved forward. I replaced the old management team, brought in a new construction company, renegotiated supplier contracts, and put enough capital into the project to finish it properly. Within 4 months, the first completed townhouses were listed. They sold faster than expected. By spring, the development was profitable. One afternoon, I drove through the neighborhood after a meeting. Families were moving in. Children rode bicycles along freshly paved streets. Landscaping crews were planting trees beside the sidewalk.
I parked near the entrance and looked at the finished buildings. This was the project my father had insisted would prove how well he understood business. Instead, it had nearly ruined him. And now it was producing millions under my ownership. For a moment, I thought I would feel satisfaction. Instead, I mostly felt distance. The money they took from me months earlier was insignificant compared with what the development was earning. But the amount had never mattered. It was what their decision revealed. They believed my money belonged to them whenever they decided someone else deserved it more. That realization changed something permanently. I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted separation. So, I stopped asking Ethan for updates, stopped wondering what Vanessa was doing, stopped checking whether Mom had tried calling. Their lives continued. So did mine. And for the first time, those two things no longer had to intersect.
Months passed. The magazine feature faded from the news cycle. The Boulder project became just another successful investment, and the chaos around my family slowly became background noise. That was exactly what I wanted. I focused on work. The Germany expansion opened ahead of schedule. Singapore followed 2 months later. One of our retail platforms signed a partnership with a major European chain, and suddenly I was spending more time on planes than in Denver. For the first time in years, family drama wasn't taking up space in my head. Then, one evening in Zurich, I received an email from Mom. The subject line was only 2 words: "You've changed." I opened it after dinner. The message was short. She wrote that she barely recognized me anymore, that success had made me cold, that family disagreements shouldn't erase decades of history. She never mentioned the money she took. She never mentioned the lies. She never mentioned the months they spent telling people I was a failure. Instead, the entire message was about what I had supposedly become. I read it twice, then closed my laptop. The truth was, I hadn't changed nearly as much as she believed. I still worked the same way. Still preferred quiet restaurants to flashy clubs, still drove my old SUV when I was home, still called the same friends I'd known before any of the money existed. What had changed was my willingness to accept their version of me. For most of my life, I had played a role without realizing it. Vanessa was the responsible one. I was the reckless one. She deserved help. I was supposed to learn lessons. Her success was evidence of good parenting. Mine was either temporary luck or something they could ignore. And whenever reality didn't fit that story, they simply rewrote reality. I was done participating. A few weeks later, Ethan visited Denver. We had dinner at a small steakhouse near my office. Halfway through the meal, he asked, "Do you ever think you'll talk to them again?" I considered the question. "I don't know. Your mom asks about you sometimes." I figured. "Your dad doesn't say much." "And Vanessa?" Ethan laughed softly. "She says she doesn't care." "That usually means she cares." "Probably." We both smiled. Then Ethan became serious. "They really believed you were going to come back, you know." "Come back how?" "Ask for help? Maybe apologize? Your dad thought eventually you'd admit they were right." I shook my head. That part still amazed me. Even after everything, they had expected the story to end with me returning to my assigned position. "And now?" I asked. "Now, I think they understand you're not coming." There was no triumph in hearing that, just relief. By the following summer, the final phase of the Boulder development was completed. The investment group hosted a small event for partners, contractors, and city representatives. I almost skipped it. Then I changed my mind. I stood near the entrance as people toured the finished neighborhood. More than 100 families already lived there. The project had gone from near bankruptcy to one of the strongest performing assets in our regional portfolio. My partner Daniel handed me a drink. "Not bad for a distressed acquisition. Not bad." "You ever tell your father what it eventually made?"
Daniel looked surprised. Why not? I watched a young couple walking toward one of the homes with their daughter, because I don't need him to know. That answer surprised even me. A year earlier, I wanted them to understand exactly how wrong they had been. Now their opinion felt irrelevant. That was when I realized the real ending had already happened. It wasn't the restaurant, it wasn't the magazine cover, it wasn't taking control of the development. It was reaching the point where none of those things needed to prove anything anymore. I had spent years succeeding quietly because I didn't want their judgment, then months planning the perfect moment to destroy that judgment. In the end, the most freeing thing was simpler. I stopped caring whether they judged me at all.
Another year passed before I saw Vanessa again. It happened by accident. I was back in Denver for a week between trips when I stopped at a hotel downtown for a lunch meeting. As I crossed the lobby, I heard my name. "Mason?" I turned. Vanessa stood near the elevators. For a second, neither of us spoke. She looked different. Not dramatically different, but softer somehow. The expensive handbag was gone. Her clothes were still professional, but there was none of the polished performance I remembered from family dinners. "Hi," I said. She walked closer. "I didn't know you were in town." "Just for a few days." There was an awkward pause. Then she said, "Can we talk?" I checked the time. "I have about 20 minutes." We sat in a quiet corner of the lobby. At first she asked about work. Germany, Singapore, the development, nothing personal. Finally, she looked down at her hands. "I owe you an apology." I didn't respond. She continued, "For the jokes, for what I said about you, for the money." "The money you accepted." Her face tightened. "Yes. You knew where it came from." "Not at first, but later?" She nodded. "And you kept the car?" "Yes." At least she didn't lie. "I told myself Mom had permission," she said. "Then, when I realized she didn't, I told myself you probably didn't need it." I almost laughed. That seems to have been everyone's favorite argument. I know. For the first time in my life, Vanessa looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I was jealous of you." That caught me off guard. "Of me?" "You didn't need their approval." I leaned back. "That's what you think?" "You left school, started businesses, did what you wanted. I spent my whole life doing everything Mom and Dad expected because I liked being the successful one." She gave a tired smile. "And when you turned out to be more successful than all of us, I hated it." There it was. Not an excuse, just the truth. "So you tried to make me look like a failure?" "Yes." I appreciated the honesty, even if it arrived years late. She looked toward the lobby windows. "After everything happened, I lost the condo, the car, I had to rebuild my finances." I heard. "Of course you did." "Not anymore." She looked back at me. "I stopped asking Ethan for updates." That seemed to surprise her. "Mason, I'm not asking you for money." "Good. I'm not asking you to fix anything either." "Even better." She almost smiled. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." I studied her face, trying to decide whether I believed her. Maybe I did. But forgiveness and trust weren't the same thing. "I accept the apology," I said. Her shoulders relaxed. But that doesn't mean we go back to how things were." "I know. I don't want Sunday dinners. I don't want family pretending nothing happened." "I understand. And I'm not going to be anyone's emergency fund." She nodded. "I wouldn't ask." My phone buzzed.
My meeting was starting. I stood. Vanessa stood too. For a moment it felt like we might hug. We didn't. "Take care of yourself," I said. "You too." I walked away, feeling strangely calm. Years earlier, I would have imagined that conversation ending with some dramatic victory, Vanessa admitting I was better, me delivering the perfect final line. Instead, there was nothing dramatic about it. She apologized, I accepted, and we went back to separate lives. That was enough. Mom and Dad were different. Neither of them ever truly apologized. They sent occasional birthday messages, short holiday emails. Once Dad wrote that he hoped time had given everyone perspective. I didn't respond. Time hadn't changed what happened. It had only made it easier to live without carrying it. And eventually that became more valuable than proving anything to them ever could.
By then, the business had grown far beyond anything I imagined when I was 19. The original marketing company was no longer even the largest part of what I owned. The software division had expanded across Europe, our Singapore office had doubled in size, and several investments that once felt risky had turned into permanent sources of income. Money stopped feeling like a score. It became freedom. Freedom to choose projects, freedom to walk away from bad partnerships, freedom to help people without expecting anything back, and most importantly, freedom from needing anyone's approval. A few months after seeing Vanessa, I created a scholarship program for young entrepreneurs who wanted to build businesses without traditional degrees. The idea came from something Claire had asked during the magazine interview. If you could talk to yourself at 19, what would you say? At the time, I gave some polished answer about perseverance, but the question stayed with me. I remembered being 19, sitting in my childhood bedroom with a cheap laptop, listening to Dad explain why leaving university would ruin my life. I remembered wondering whether he was right. So the scholarship wasn't about proving college was useless. It wasn't. It was about giving people another path when the standard one wasn't right for them. The first year, we funded 12 founders. One of them was a 20-year-old woman building software for independent restaurants. Another was a mechanic, developing a cheaper diagnostic device for electric vehicles. Watching them work reminded me why I had started in the first place. Not for magazine covers, not for luxury cars, not even for money. I wanted control over my own life. And somewhere along the way, I had finally gotten it. One evening after a scholarship event, Ethan and I walked through downtown Denver. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "Your parents spent years worrying you'd embarrass them." I laughed. "And? Now everyone they know mentions you like you're some family legend." "That sounds exhausting." "They've changed the story." I stopped walking. "What story?" Now your mom tells people they always knew you were ambitious. For a second, I just stared at him. Then I started laughing, really laughing. Of course they had. The same people who once predicted my failure had rewritten themselves into early believers. Years earlier, that would have infuriated me. Now, it was almost entertaining. Does she mention kicking me out? No. The bank account? No. Vanessa offering me delivery work? Ethan grinned. Definitely not. We continued walking. Does it bother you? I thought about it. No. And I meant it. Their version of the past belonged to them. I knew it happened. Vanessa knew. Ethan knew. Most importantly, I knew who I had been before anyone applauded. That was enough. A few weeks later, I drove past my parents' old neighborhood. Their house had been sold the previous year. Ethan told me they moved into a smaller place outside the city after Dad's investment losses. I didn't know the new address.
I never asked. As I passed the familiar street, I slowed near the house. Different car in the driveway, different curtains, children's bicycles lying near the garage. For years, that building had represented something enormous in my mind. Judgment, family expectations, arguments, the place where I was constantly reminded that I was supposedly behind everyone else. Now it was just a house. I kept driving. 10 minutes later, I reached the Boulder development. The evening sun reflected off rows of finished homes. People were grilling in backyards. Kids were playing basketball near the community park. I pulled over for a minute and watched. This place had once been the centerpiece of my father's dream. Then it became part of my revenge. Eventually, it became something better than both. It became useful. Families lived here. People had jobs because the project survived. Investors made money. Life moved forward. And standing there, I realized that was the best possible ending. Not destroying what they built. Taking something broken and making it work without them.
I stayed there for another minute before pulling back onto the road. The sun was dropping behind the mountains, washing the neighborhood in orange light. For years, I thought success would feel like proving everyone wrong. I imagined some perfect moment where my parents would finally look at me differently, where Vanessa would admit she had underestimated me, where every insult would somehow be erased by one undeniable victory. But that wasn't what happened. They did eventually realize they were wrong. They saw the magazine. They saw the companies. They saw the development. They watched the son they had treated like a cautionary tale become more successful than any of them expected. And none of it fixed what came before. That was the part nobody tells you. Being proven right doesn't automatically repair the damage caused by people who spent years refusing to see you clearly. Sometimes there is no dramatic reconciliation. Sometimes people apologize too late. Sometimes they rewrite history instead of admitting what they did. And sometimes, the healthiest ending is simply deciding that their version of you no longer matters. That night, I returned to my penthouse and stepped onto the balcony. Denver stretched beneath me, thousands of lights glowing between the dark buildings. I thought about the kid who had left university at 19 with barely enough money to cover rent. He had no idea what was coming. The failed campaigns, the clients who disappeared without paying, the nights spent wondering whether quitting school had actually been a terrible mistake. He definitely couldn't have imagined this view. But strangely, I didn't feel proud because of the apartment or the companies or the money sitting in accounts I rarely checked. I felt proud because I had finally built a life that belonged entirely to me. Nobody could threaten to take their approval away. Nobody could tell me I needed their permission. Nobody could decide what success was supposed to look like for me. My phone buzzed on the table behind me. A message from Ethan. He had sent a photo from one of the old family Sunday dinners. Mom and Dad at the table, Vanessa holding a glass of wine, me sitting near the edge of the frame, smiling politely. Underneath, Ethan had written, "Hard to believe how much changed." I looked at the photo for a few seconds, then replied, "Not really. I just stopped pretending nothing was wrong." I put the phone away. There was no anger anymore, no need for another confrontation, no fantasy about making them regret everything. They had made their choices. I had made mine. And the distance between those choices had become permanent. A few years earlier, Dad had pointed toward his front door and told me that if I couldn't survive without them, I could live on the streets. He wanted that sentence to scare me. Instead, it became one of the strangest gifts he ever gave me. Because walking out that night forced me to see something I should have understood much earlier. I had already survived without them. I had already succeeded without them. The only thing I was still depending on was the hope that someday they would approve of the person I had become. Once I let go of that, there was nothing left for them to control. I looked across the skyline and smiled. For years, they believed I was one bad month away from coming home defeated. Instead, I built companies across continents. I bought properties they couldn't imagine owning. I turned their failed investment into a profitable neighborhood. And when they expected me to crawl back asking for a place to stay, I did something much better. I stopped needing a place at their table. Dad once told me I might end up living on the streets. In a way, he was right. I just ended up owning half the block instead.
My name is Mason Reed.
I'm 31, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that success doesn't automatically earn you respect from people who decided years ago who you were supposed to be. I started working at 18 and left university before finishing my second year. My parents treated it like a disaster. My mother, Diane, said I was throwing away the only stable future I would ever have. My father, Robert, looked over his newspaper and said, "You'll understand when the real world catches up with you." What they didn't know was that the real world had already caught up with me, and I was doing pretty well in it. At 19, I started a small online marketing business from a rented bedroom in Denver. It began with local stores, then grew into e-commerce consulting and software tools for retailers. By my late 20s, I owned stakes in 3 companies, employed more than 80 people. I never told them, partly because I didn't care to brag, and partly because they had already decided I was the family disappointment. My younger sister, Vanessa, was the opposite. She had done everything according to plan. Business school, an MBA, then a polished job at a major consulting firm in Chicago. My parents loved mentioning her title at dinners. They loved her expensive apartment and the confidence she wore like a badge. Whenever I visited, the comparison arrived sooner or later. "So, Mason," Dad would say, "still doing websites?" Something like that. Vanessa would smile over her wine. "Startups are fun while you're young. Eventually you need something dependable." I usually let it go. They didn't know I bought a condo overlooking downtown Denver. They didn't know I had paid off the mortgage in under 2 years. They didn't know the plain, dark SUV I drove to their house was the least expensive car I owned. Keeping quiet was easier than trying to convince people who enjoyed misunderstanding me. Then came the Saturday night that changed everything. My mother texted and asked me to stop by because they needed to discuss something important. When I arrived, Dad was standing near the fireplace, Vanessa was on the sofa, and Mom had that tight expression she wore whenever she believed she was about to teach someone a lesson. "Mason," Dad began, "we've been talking about you." I knew the evening wasn't going anywhere good. "You're 31, he continued. "You've had enough time to make this internet thing work. At some point you need to admit when a plan has failed." I stared at him. "What exactly do you think has failed?" Vanessa laughed softly. "Come on, you avoid talking about money, you never mention promotions, you never talk about a real company. What are we supposed to think?" Mom folded her arms. "We think you've been drifting, and we're done pretending otherwise." I almost smiled. For years, they had mistaken privacy for failure, and now they were about to make the biggest mistake of all, acting on that assumption.